So I'm privileged to be here with three top experts on China-Africa relations. And so it's a great privilege for me because of COVID. I think this is maybe the first time in 3 years that I've actually been on stage with this many China-Africa experts. And so we're going to have three, and we're going to go a little bit different than what's in your program. We're going to begin with my good friend Eric Olander. So now the shoe is on the other foot. Now I get to put him to the fire. And Eric has been working in this space for a long time. He's a journalist, I guess, by training. He's a fluent French speaker. He's a German citizen. He's created something called the China-Africa podcast, which is one of the most influential forums for discussions on these things, and has now evolved that into what you see here, the China Global South Project, which is now touching on and expanding into what I had mentioned, which is the kind of, if we see China-Africa as part of China's interactions with the Global South. And so he's becoming a leading voice not only on China-Africa, where he cut his teeth, but now into all of these other aspects. To his left is my old friend Joseph Asunka. Joseph holds a PhD from UCLA. I know because I was there with him. And he is the CEO of the Afrobarometer. If you're not familiar with the Afrobarometer, I would urge you to look at their work. As he said during lunch, it's the Keough of Africa, right? So they are following, and they know more about what's going on in terms of African views across a range of issues, not just China, than anyone else. And Joseph, I can tell you, because without him I would not have passed my statistics course, is very rigorous in his analysis and very statistically driven, right? So we're thrilled to have him here to shed light on African views. And then to your right, I guess, is Sharon Bar-David, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and Government at Ben Gurion University. She's ADD, she's finishing up soon, so soon to be doctor. And she is already, having not even graduated, the co-editor of a newly published book. Unfortunately, it's in Hebrew, so I can't read it, but many of you can, called Meeting of the Giants, Reflections on China-Africa Relations. So, without any further introductions, although some interruptions perhaps, I want to invite Eric to set the stage. And so we're going to have Eric, and then Ms. Bar-David, and then Joseph is going to help us to understand how Africans understand these phenomena. So.
Okay, so we're going to pick up the conversation a little bit where we left off in the last session and talk about specifically FOCAC, which is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It's absolutely essential to understand these forums that China has in the Arab world, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and they have it also now increasingly in Asia as well. And so this was started in 2003. And today it is, they just had one last year. So, but before we kind of go into FOCAC and what happened, let me just kind of walk you back through the current state of the China-Africa relationship. So today, last year they did $254 billion of two-way trade. That makes it the continent's largest trading partner bilaterally. Please remember, though, that Africa's largest trading partner region-wise is Europe by far. So Europe does considerably more as a region-to-region, continent-to-continent, but country with a continent, which is a very unusual pairing. But a little fun fact here, just this quarter, first quarter of 2022, China did more trade with Africa in that one quarter than Africa did with the entire United States all last year. So it shows you the scale that China has in terms of its leadership. But the problem is that the trade is highly distorted. So Africa is a continent of 54, 55 countries, but we're looking at about half of it's concentrated in just 5 countries. 70% of that trade is oil, mineral, and timber. Most African countries do very little trade with China. They import a lot, in some cases, but there's countries like Burundi that don't even import a lot and they don't sell a lot. So I urge you, when you think about Africa, to avoid the oversimplification of Africa as a country, Africa as a singular entity. There's an enormous amount of variety. A third of almost all the trade is concentrated in just South Africa and Nigeria. Nigeria is because it has the largest consumer market on the continent. South Africa, in part, because it's a transshipment. So a lot of the trade isn't coming out of South Africa, but it's the cobalt coming down from the Congo, it's some of the minerals that come down from Zimbabwe and then pass through the port of Durban, and so they get the credit for it. Africa, though, China is very important to Africa, but Africa is not important to China. And this is a very important piece of data to understand where their geopolitical priorities are. Africans will oftentimes tell you, misinformed, that China needs them. And I always have to have these very awkward conversations to say, if you disappear tomorrow from their $6.05 trillion global trade balance, China will wake up tomorrow and never know that you were there. They are close to the bottom of the list. The Persian Gulf, actually, this is a misnomer how they do it. The Arab world as a whole does $330 billion of trade with China. How you define the Arab world gets complicated. And so Africa really is at the bottom of the list, and it's not really going to go up much more. We're getting close to peak trade in many respects, in part because China now has all of these alternatives it didn't have 10 years ago. It's doing $450 billion of trade with South America. It's doing $1 trillion plus with Southeast Asia. And the oil, mineral, and timber that it used to get from Africa, it can get now anywhere on the Belt and Road. And the problem that Africans have had is they have not added value to their exports. And so we're still talking about raw commodities that, again, can be sourced and purchased anywhere. The only exception to that is the cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. That is the only, they have 70% of that. Now, to Josh's point, again, in the highly unstable nature of the relationship, and this is what I keep telling US government officials, stop talking about debt traps. The real problem is trade deficits. And when you look at these numbers, and this is what Josh was talking about, and I'm glad you mentioned it. Ethiopia, 4.1 billion in imports, 91.4 million in exports. Now, today we have a situation where the value of the currencies are depreciating because the US interest rates have gone up, currencies left. They're burning so much of what limited hard currency they have for imports from China. And so this is a very important statistic when I'm going to talk about FOCAC and what happened last year. That these trade deficits are extraordinarily dangerous, and they're not sustainable in the long run. When we talk about investment, people make the big mistake in saying that China is the largest investor in Africa. China is not the largest investor in Africa. Today it remains the United Kingdom, France, and the United States are often far ahead. China actually, its engagement oftentimes is through loans, and it's through other things, but that's not investment. So when they build the railways, they're not investing in that railway. They're providing the financing and the construction, but they're getting their money back on this. But it shows you a little bit, I like this graph, because again, when we talk about the United States in particular, the US peaked in 2009. And again, what was in 2009? They were buying a ton of Nigerian oil. And since then, the United States, through its shale oil and its own oil development, doesn't need to buy African oil anymore, and it is not backfilled with anything else. Chinese investment, for the most part, has remained flat, and it goes up a little bit, but Chinese investment in Africa is not really the story. And so when you hear people talk about China as the largest investor, that's not the key story. So, with that in mind, trade deficits, investment, and this big pullback in development financing, FOCAC happened in Dakar, Senegal last year, and it took place. And the FOCAC process, it's very important because there's a perception out there that China tells Africa what to do. Now, the early FOCACs, that was the case. They said, this is the agenda, take it or leave it. The countries went, okay, we'll take it. Now, this is a year-long negotiation, collaborative process, and in this particular instance, Africans drove the agenda in many respects. So here are the outcomes. This is what came out of it. And let me just kind of back up a little bit. In 2012, it was a $20 billion financial package of loans, investments, all sorts of money that came out of FOCAC and that FOCAC. 2018, it jumped to $60 billion. Okay, huge amounts of money. Oh, and that's $60 billion over 3 years. Okay, we're talking about Global Gateway from the Europeans proposing 300 billion euros indefinite. Okay, the Chinese are rolling in with 60 billion packages every 3 years. DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, receives $60 billion, but again, open-ended. So the scale of Chinese money at these FOCACs is unrivaled. Now, at this year, so here's what it broke down to this year. They've committed to imports, African imports, before 2025. So they heard the problem of the trade deficits. This is what the African government said: we can't keep buying stuff from you. We need to be able to sell stuff to you as well. 300 billion. Right now, the trade is about 100 billion, 110 billion of exports. Mostly, again, oil, mineral, and timber. So they're proposing to triple exports in the next, 3 years? I don't know if they're going to do that, but okay. They're creating new green lanes for expedited agricultural imports. This is the commodities. This is also what the Chinese are doing in ASEAN and other agricultural exporting regions. Here we go, $10 billion financing for African exports. This is trade promotion. But again, you see the theme of the package is very much to address the key African concerns. Now, the narrative that came out of FOCAC this year was, well, the total, when you add that all up, was 40 billion. You see the Chinese, they're pulling back. And a couple people said, whoa, because they promised, I forgot to mention, 1 billion vaccines. Oops. 1 billion vaccines. Again, another African need, because Africa was starved for vaccines and continues to be so today. So when we look at the total for FOCAC last year, when you add up all of the announced, it was 40 billion. But as some people pointed out, when you add up the value of the contribution of 1 billion vaccines, it brings you, depending on how you price it, and they were pricing some of these at $25, $30 a shot. These are not cheap vaccines sometimes. It brings you right back up to $60 billion. So the Chinese, just again, when you hear that. Now, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he came this year and he said, this was just about 2 months ago, we are going to live and fulfill that commitment to the billion vaccines. There's a lot of great reason to doubt that. This is my favorite chart. I love this chart. This is Chinese global vaccine distributions. And it just fell like a cliff in November. What happened in November? Can anybody think of what happened in November? November, December last year. Think in your pandemic history. Well, that was about the change that we went from the Delta virus to the Omicron virus. And the effectiveness of Chinese vaccines combating Delta was, and this again was a misnomer, was people went on the infection rates. People were getting infected with Chinese vaccines, but they weren't being hospitalized and they weren't dying. And if you're in a developing country, keeping people out of your public health system was the only priority. So Chinese vaccines were very popular. The problem is they woke up and they said, uh-oh, this doesn't work against Omicron. And so all of a sudden the developing countries said, we don't want it. At that same time, the US finally got its act together. And Pfizer and Moderna started shipping out massive amounts because the United States was getting as much vaccinated as it was going to get. And so this was this convergence here of the developing countries not wanting Chinese vaccines, and at the same time, they're not working, and this is still a problem today. And so that's why I don't think they're ever going to fulfill their billion vaccine commitment. Also, just to bear in mind too, on these $60 billion pledges, in the last FOCAC, they committed 60, but they only spent 40 billion. Now we can say 40 billion, that was $40 billion in 3 years that they spent dedicated exclusively to Africa. Find me another country that is committing that kind of resource to Africa. Nobody. Nobody even comes close. Even USAID and those aid programs are nowhere near that level. So you can see a little bit what you're going to hear from Joseph at Afrobarometer. The public opinion of the Chinese is far more positive than it is than most people assume, because the narratives that we consume in the West are universally negative, and the narratives in Africa are much more complex. Let me just quickly. I've got two more points here. What came out of FOCAC as well was the end of the big infrastructure projects that we've talked about. This is another one of my favorite charts. This was, it peaked in 2016 of the global, this is from the two Chinese policy banks, the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank. The Chinese are out of the business now of building massive infrastructure like railroads and big power stations. Those days are gone. What they're doing now is they're doing smaller projects, smaller loans, with a focus on ROI and profitability. They're pulling in money now from different sources, so it's not just coming from the policy banks, it's coming from state-owned enterprises, it's coming from semi-independent banks like the Industrial Commercial Bank of China. It's coming from a lot of different sources now. Venture capital is now getting involved as well. $250 million of VC money went to Africa in 2020. And these are aligned with new priorities. So what Josh was talking about was very, very important about the scale of the project. So this was just in the past 12 months what they financed. Notice these are all in the tens of millions and the high hundreds of millions, but all of them have a pathway to profitability. Most of them are tech-based. This is the digital Silk Road. That is, again, there's revenue that hits the moment that you flip the switch on a cloud data center or on a mobile network. And then the last point that I want to make is that we often talk about China in the context of the state sector. The state now in Africa is pulling back in a very big way. It's the private sector that's the next story in Africa. And the private sector is fierce. They dominate the mobile phone market. They dominate the West African mobile payment market. The #1 music service, Boomplay, is Chinese, crushing Apple and Spotify. Hisense is making white goods out of South Africa. TikTok is crushing it in a continent of 19-year-olds. The United States and Europeans are not building products specifically tailored for African consumers the way that the Chinese are. Cars are built for developing countries with floods, high dust, humidity, low maintenance. So that's Cherry there. And then there's StarTimes, which is the second largest pay TV satellite service. So let's try and start broadening our perspective now on the engagement, and that feeds all back to the priorities set by African negotiators at last year's FOCAC. Private, more trade, more business, less aid. Thank you.
So, hello everybody. Today I present a fascinating case study that captures some of the complexities of Chinese-led development policies in Africa. The Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, built in the colonial era by the French, refurbished in the 19th century by a Chinese construction company, and still operated by a Chinese company. This case study inspired the recently published book by Onita Vidar and myself, The Meeting of the Giants. And I will make the case that the current literature covering Chinese-Ethiopian relations reflects neither local perspective and perceptions of the specific project, nor Chinese-Ethiopian relations in their broader sense. The literature tends to perceive China as the main change agent, with the Chinese described as proactive, and the Africans are perceived as passive and the receivers. However, as I assert in my book, the relations between China and Africa are in fact relations between two giants. While China is doubtless an influential superpower, the African states also have the ability to shape their relationship with China. The Addis Djibouti case study illustrates the power of local African communities to determine success or failure of Chinese-run development projects. My analysis perspective is grounded on the assumption that there are always gaps between policy intentions and the reality on the ground. Developmental policies are, after all, planned interventions that may produce unintended consequences. So, a few words about the railway. It was originally built by a French company in the 19th century, and along the years gradually deteriorated. The railway line stretches along 759 kilometers from Addis Ababa via Adama, Dirdawa, and Djibouti port. In 2011, the Ethiopian government signed a contract with Chinese state-owned companies for the refurbishment of the railway line, and refurbished line-initiated operations in 2018 under the management of a Chinese contractor. Over the past 2 decades, massive Chinese investments have swamped unprecedented changes in Ethiopian markets and infrastructures, which have received considerable attention. However, the focus has remained on a broader geopolitical level, with little exploration on how local communities in Ethiopia experience, interpret, and exploit changing realities that have been engendered by Ethiopian-Chinese relations. Ethiopia infrastructure, and particularly road density, is among the least developed in Africa, and a considerable obstacle for its development. From Chinese perspective, Ethiopia is an important stepping stone in its bid for global economic political role. The Chinese discourse in this context emphasizes the importance of Addis-Djibouti line to the port of Dorale in Djibouti as a strategic point in the BRI, contributing to the development of commerce between China and Africa. Consequently, the official discourse is predominantly positive and optimistic, typified with words such as cooperation, win-win situation, friendship between the nation, mutual help, and so on. So, experiences of locals from the railway are widely variant. Locals expressed mixed feelings towards the refurbished railway, both excitement and disappointment, hope and hostility. The predominant emotion depends on the occupation, ethnic affiliation, and the proximity to the railway road of the individual, and whether he personally was able to find a new job in the operation or as a result of it. Mostly near the capital, locals identify with the official perspective and experience the train as a crucial part of Ethiopia's development process. However, as we headed east along the railway into the Amhara regions, voices grew more critical. In the academic literature, development is defined as a gradual, incremental process transforming the economy and the society step by step, layer by layer. In contrast, the Chinese model is vertical, offering in the Chinese experience a massively accelerated development process. This is a model which Ethiopian governments seem eager to emulate through the establishment of development pockets along the railway line. One could drive dozens of kilometers in the wilderness and suddenly see a plant, a train station, a modern hotel, or a brand new industrial park. These development pockets stand out from their surroundings. Many of my informants referred to these new buildings as parachuted monuments, inspired by colonial or Chinese architecture and unconnected to the Ethiopian culture, perceiving them as even an insult to the Ethiopian people. Unlike the historical railway line from Addis to Djibouti that was protected and cherished by the local population, the refurbished line invokes alienation rather than integration. Although the official Chinese and Ethiopian discourses emphasize the opportunities offered by the development project, many local Ethiopians are skeptical. From focus group discussions held with farmers, I have learned that many pastures and cultivated land have been expropriated without proper compensation for the development project, since according to the Ethiopian law, the land belongs to the state rather than the cultivators. As a result, many locals have lost their traditional livelihood and were passed over for jobs in new plants established on the expropriated lands due to their lack of education. Even those who were able to secure jobs in the plants or in the train found their wages to be much lower than their Chinese counterparts. Many of the new workers employed in the newly created positions are university graduates and are able to communicate in English with their Chinese colleagues. However, most of the Chinese workers were less had less formal education than the Ethiopian employed in the development project and do not speak any English. Moreover, their work ethics differ. For example, a Chinese worker is used to work 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. A Chinese manager is not averse to performing his underling's job when necessary. An Ethiopian worker, however, expects to work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, and rejects performing work outside of his own job description. These differences have resulted in numerous misunderstandings and clashes between Chinese and Ethiopian workers, as the Ethiopian often feel mistreated, discriminated, and even enslaved. During my field work, I have learned about stabbing incidents when Chinese managers were stabbed by their Ethiopian workers. As for the Chinese workers, many refer to their Ethiopian counterparts with derogatory names. Chinese informants always discussed about harmony between the two nations. Ethiopian informants, in contrast, spoke in terms of exploitation. How the Ethiopians were being used by the Chinese. Most of the Ethiopian informants perceived the Chinese as arrogant and disrespectful. The Chinese were always the managers and paid the Ethiopians lower wages than the Chinese employees performing the exact same job. At first, it seemed that the Chinese and the Ethiopians were presenting opposing narratives. However, as I was talking to one of my Chinese informants, it suddenly became clear that the Ethiopians' conception of harmony is not the same as the Chinese interpretation. The Ethiopian identified harmony with equality and fairness. However, the Chinese harmony means maintaining social order via strict hierarchy. For these reasons, the locals had started to use the weapons of the weak by openly blocking the rain, throwing rocks at it, as well as deniable actions such as driving animals into the railway. When the train collides with the animals, the train operation is suspended, and the owner of the animal is compensated, representing a double win for the Ethiopian protester. Transmutation is perceived as contributing to the national unity and moderation of conflicts, enabling people from different ethnic groups to meet, contact, and communicate directly, opposing them to different narratives and promoting better understanding. However, the Addis Djibouti Railway show us that actually pre-existing conflicts are being worse and worse. Amhara generally perceive the railway project as important for Ethiopia's economic development, whereas Somalis and Oromo perceive the development plans as designed for further Amhara interests. To conclude, there is a chasm separating the official discourse from the local perspectives. While the official discourse, Chinese and Ethiopian, adheres to a rosy-tinted development vision of Ethiopia, many locals stridently accuse the government of corruption, mismanagement, land expropriation, and inadequate job opportunities. This difference in perception and experience verifies my own analysis perspective the unintended consequences of a policy. The Chinese anticipated the Ethiopians would embrace the railway and be grateful to the Chinese. However, the Oromo and the Somali, the vast majority of the local population on the road, are not happy with the distribution of benefits, costs, and costs from the projects, and therefore disrupt the operation of the train. No one consulted us, they repeat.
That was excellent. Very interesting analysis of the grassroots versus elite levels and the differences between different ethnic groups within Ethiopia. Fascinating.
All right, thank you so much, and of course, thank you to GIS as University of Notre Dame, my good friend here. Really great to be here. I think Joshua started by saying that there are 3 China-Africa experts here. I want to excuse myself from that. I am nowhere near a China expert. I study Africa, but I am not an expert on China-Africa. What I have today is to talk about people's experiences and what Africans are telling us about their experiences. And I'm glad that I came between Eric and Sharon because, I come in the middle. Eric does have the big picture in terms of what China is doing in Africa. Sharon has talked about the micro experiences, and what we try to do at Afrobarometer is to see what are the perspectives of Africans on what China does on the continent. Of course, a range of issues in China is just a piece of it. So this has continued to be something we do quite often. And I must say, of course, some of our data are being used in Beijing. I've had a Chinese ambassador in Ghana come to my office and call me into their office to talk about this data. So it's kind of resonating with them at the country level, but also in Beijing as well, which they've made us aware that they are watching and are making use of it. So just to start, I think what I'll do is just provide a brief background of the Afrobarometer for the sake of those who don't know us, so that you can just catch up to speed. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the data points that we have about Africans' experiences with Chinese on the continent. So first of all, who we are. This is a Pan-African network. We've been in existence since 1999, so a little over 2 decades ago. And when we started, that was just when Africa was becoming more and more democratic. And the wind of democracy started sometime in 1989, and it started blowing at that point. And the founding fathers thought, if we want democracy to thrive in this continent, we need to bring the people along. We can't just have it be an elite thing that they are bringing something called democracy and then trying to introduce it from the top down, but it has to be taken as a grassroots mobilization. So bringing people's voices into the discourse and the transitions was very important to do that. So since then, we've completed about 8 rounds of surveys, and each survey takes about 18 months, sometimes it takes 2 years. The last round, because of COVID, actually took us almost 2 years to complete the field work. We had to take a break at some point and then come back after COVID has subsided a little bit. All right, so what's the goal? As I said, we want to give the public a voice in policy making, in decision making, in the democratic transition process. And that's exactly why Afrobarometer was born. And there are 3 key things we do. We want to produce data, reliable data, public opinion data that's available to the public as a public good, and we produce it as a public good. We never sell any part of our intellectual property, whether it's the data production or the publications that come out of it. All of it is made freely available. We disseminate these results broadly, and then we seek to build capacity on the continent to do this kind of work. And as Joshua mentioned, I come from the quantitative background, and I like to teach students about quantitative methods, and I felt like being on the Afrobarometer would give me the opportunity to engage with students on the continent and also support capacity building on the continent. All right, so we have become the leading source of data on the continent on Africans' attitudes, and we have helped, of course, to decolonize the study of African populations in society, because we have a network of partners in the 39 countries that do this work every 2 years. All right, so what was the roots of the problem? As I mentioned, there are pundits always saying, we know what the public thinks. This is what I think the public thinks. So we need to ask them. We just don't have to speak for them. Let's engage them and speak to them and let them voice their own opinions, as opposed to us saying that this is what we think the public thinks. And of course, this happens in most places where whatever happens in the cities and where a lot of the middle class lives and what happens in the rural areas is completely different. And so usually when we do pre-election surveys and our surveys are predicting somebody to win, those in the cities will not agree with that because they feel like, the way the situation is, they know that somebody else is going to win, whether it's the opposition or not. The results come and they are surprised because people are so detached from the rural areas that they don't really see what happens in the rural areas in terms of electoral support or candidate support. All right, so we managed to address this gap, where there's this failing gap between what happens in these urban centers, where the urban centers are always anti the ruling government in most cases, but the rural areas are not always like that, and that's where the deficit in the governments. So where do we work? These are the countries where we work. And you will realize the central part of Africa is a place we haven't been able to penetrate. The Afrobarometer, we are only able to work in places where the political conditions are conducive enough for us to send surveyors out in the fields, that the government is acceptable to us asking these sensitive political questions, and that there's a recent census framework. And some of these countries, the censuses were taken sometime in the 1970s and they don't have an updated census. And so there are certain factors that limit whether or not we're able to get into some countries. But by and large, we've been into most countries and we want to be able to cover the entire continent at some point going forward. Of course, some countries we've gone in once and we have had to exit because of the hostility of government. In Burundi, our partner had to go into exile because when we released the results of our term limits, Nkurunziza wasn't a friend of term limits, and so he sent our national partner to exile for that reason. And we are always in a love-hate relationship with government because some of the data will speak favorably of the government, sometimes it doesn't speak too favorably of them. And then so, even though they love to hate us, sometimes they love us as well because some of the data speaks well of them. And we continue to thrive because of that. All right, so what are some of the topics we cover? These are the topics we cover. On the left side is what we call our standard tracking questions. So these are the topics that we track over time, and we have maintained all of them since 1999, so that we can have over time trends in these issues. And on the right are the special topics. So each time we are going to go into the fields, we ask our experts, what are the major debates, what are the core issues out there in the world, on the continent that we should be tracking? And then we would identify those topics and include questions to cover them. So this time around, we're looking at COVID-19, climate change, and environmental governance. We're also looking at youth issues and youth unemployment on the continent. All right, so now let me turn to why I came here, perspectives of Africans on the continent and in terms of Africa. And I think Eric already preempted some of the work, what I'm going to say here, that it is a mixed thing because as Sharon mentioned, the micro experiences with Chinese and the macro experience of the Chinese government creates different scenarios where Africans love Chinese for certain things and they hate them for other things. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. All right, so one of the questions we usually ask our respondents, and this we've asked for several years, just getting people's opinion. If you were to look at the US or other countries' external influencers, which one do you think is the best model for your country's development? And as Eric mentioned, yes, the United States comes up on top, but China is right there. Right? So when I talk of best model, the US and China are always apart, quite similar in this sense. The last survey, it was 33% for the US and then 22% for China. I would come to break it down and realize, of course, the younger people are more drawn to the US model, and the older people seem to be more drawn to the Chinese model. But when we break it down by country, some interesting results do emerge. You would see that in some countries the US model is top, like in Liberia and others. On the left side, certainly the US model is top. If you look down towards the Francophone countries in particular, then the Chinese model becomes much more appealing. And so there must be something happening in the Francophone zone. Of course, it could be as a result of their experience with the colonial power of France, which has been what has been driving some of the perceptions or views that we capture on the continent. But this just to give you a snapshot in terms of the variation of people's attraction to the US or China on the continent. The other question we normally ask people is, which country or which external player has the most influence on your country? And with that one, when it comes to influence, then China comes on top. And I think this is what Eric was alluding to, that the Chinese presence and involvement is so visible that you can't escape it in several countries. And when we ask people about it, they will have always told us that Chinese have the most influence on their continent, and positive influence. That's what we get from our respondents. Of course, other countries also come in. The US and China are also always tracking each other, whether it is best model or it is positive influence. The US and China track each other quite well. And sometimes we tend to believe that when one is going up, the other goes up. It's really not a zero-sum game. For Africans, it is a win-win situation, and it's not a zero-sum game. Right, but of course, others like the regional powers, former colonial powers do come in. Russia actually comes in here. What I'm waiting to see is what happens in this current study that is ongoing, given what is happening in Ukraine now. And it'll be interesting to then see what happens, what's the overtime trend. The United Nations, the African Union also, of course, come up quite a bit. All right, so this is the summary of it. China ranks second. 63% of Africans think that China has a positive influence in their countries. And the countries that have seen China as having a positive influence are the darker red countries. Starting from Mali, which is way out there compared to other countries, and down to Ghana, where less than half of citizens think that the US has a positive influence on their country. All right, so what is driving this? Of course, there are lots of factors, and I hope that we can dig deeper into these, but investments in infrastructure certainly is huge. And then affordable products. China can make products that is affordable to people. And why not? If you can't buy an American car or an American phone, you can certainly get a phone from China that is affordable to you. It makes it quite appealing. All right, but with that, when it comes to conditionalities, I mean, we talked about the China and no strings attached, but except, of course, the political strings that I just talked about. There are certain things you can't cross. But, there's certain things when we asked Africans about conditionality and aid. I think this is where the tensions lie. For a majority of citizens, they think that African governments should have the right to make decisions about how to spend resources they receive from external sources. But then there's this tension between, do you tie it to democratic development, or how do you give your aid? And China does give this support sometimes without strings attached. Or if there are strings attached, the citizens are not really aware of what strings are attached. And so it comes to them as no strings attached. But then the Western world, sometimes the strings are very clear. Everybody knows what's happening. So I do think I have one slide that talks about tying the aid to democratic development. For that particular one, lots of countries and several citizens think that when aid is coming to Africa, it should be tied to democratic development. And that's where Africans are a bit split. It's just split halfway. Half think that it should be tied, and half think that it shouldn't be tied. But when it comes to issues of just development aid in general, we do have the majority thinking that government should be left to make their decisions. All right, so admiring China's role, we keep asking ourselves, so if Africans are admiring China as a model, how does that affect democratic norms and standards on the continent? But what we see is that really on the continent, whether or not you are in favor of the Chinese model, it doesn't affect your attitudes towards democratic norms. Support for democracy is solid. Democratic norms like term limit and others is still solid on the continent. And so there doesn't seem to be an apparent effect on people's attitudes towards democratic norms. Even when we break it down by age groups, it's still the same. It's just that younger people seem to thrive more by supporting, being more solid about their support for democracy than older folks. But it's just marginal, within the margin of error that our data, our samples allow. The bigger concerns, and I think Sharon alluded to this, is just the experiences of Chinese citizens and people's experiences directly with Chinese citizens on the continent. And several of you have seen all the stories in the news about rights abuses, and Sharon alluded to this. Some of the topics that we have covered, of course, in Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, Chinese are everywhere, and the atrocities that they create with citizens may be beginning to erode some of the confidence that Africans actually have on China. And so I think in the medium to long term, this is the tension that China has to deal with. How to deal with the exportation of labor to Africa and still maintaining the good image that China wants to create on the continent. Going it small and beautiful is good, but if the beauty comes with a lot of ugliness on the continent, I think it's going to create a dark picture for them. All right, so that's a snapshot of this. As Josh said, if you go onto our website, there are loads of data, loads of information that you can analyze. So I'll leave it here and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, as you can see, we've got a wealth of knowledge up here, and this is a fantastic panel because we really are dealing with this issue from different levels, right? Eric is coming from the highest level, and Sharon is over here at the lowest level, and then Joseph is kind of looking from the middle level, going country by country. So we've got a great wealth of information. So if there are any questions, we can turn to you. I have, of course, some questions that I'll grab, but I see one, I think that's Alex in the back, if I'm not mistaken. The mask, it's hard to see. Oh, and then Yunnan, of course. Eddie, could you help us with the mic on up here? Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to ask Eric about the, you mentioned the China in the last FOCAC promised to increase exports from Africa. Could you please talk a little bit about the plan, I don't know if it's signed or just planned, the free trade, Pan-Africa free trade agreement, how, because China already signed an FTA with Mauritius, I think?
Mauritius is the only one right now.
Right, but the Pan-African free trade agreement, do you think this will change in any way the trade relationship with China?
Eric, before you jump at this, I want to build, because this was actually my question too. I have heard, and the name Deborah Brodigan was mentioned, that raving about 400 product lines, all tax free, right? All in tariff free. But I've looked at that 400, and Africa doesn't sell any of that stuff, and except for the minerals and the oil. And so it didn't actually move the needle. And so when Chinese consumers go, they buy what they want to buy, like all of us, right? You're free in China to purchase what you want. Nobody can force you to buy an African product. So this is building on Alex's question. This issue of how do you remedy trade deficits? We in the United States have not been able to do this, right? So how can a political leader like Wang Yi make a statement and that actually impact the trade portfolio?
Well, bear in mind first that was not making the statement on the FOCAC. That was the African countries expressing their intention and their desires. In terms of, there is no such thing as anything Pan-African that has really worked out in any sense. So coordinating trade has been very difficult. The closest thing to this is the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and there is a lot of talk coming out of Chinese think tanks about bolting the Belt and Road Initiative, which is distribution outbound from the continent, in with the AFCFTA. One of the concerns, by the way, about the AFCFTA is that Chinese companies are going to come and set up and just start undercutting everybody within domestically in Africa. There's no trade barriers now on the continent. So you can set up in Nigeria and flood the zone with socks into Ghana, and no Ghanaian producer can ever compete. So that is a little bit of a concern that I have, and I suspect based on past Chinese practice, we should expect that. You know what the Chinese have done, or actually I should say this, the Nigerians have done to the textile business in Kano, in northern Nigeria. They destroyed it. Chinese low-cost imports basically displaced the entire business. So I have a feeling that the AFCFTA presents that kind of risk. The other challenge on trade right now, and we're seeing this play out in Kenya, is that they've announced that you can export avocados, and this is the agricultural exports. The problem is that China is a very regulated country, much like the United States and Europe. And the regulatory burdens now are so high that exporters can't meet them. It's too costly to do the flash freezing, it's too costly to do all of the processing to get the products ready for export. And so this avocado issue is the best example of this for the past 2 or 3 years. They've been excited about avocados, but they've not been able to export a single avocado. So you have the regulatory hurdles, you have no free trade agreements. I think a free trade agreement with China would be a disaster for Africa, because I think the Chinese would flood the zone. They would benefit far more than Africans would.
Eric, what about the fishing issue? Right? Wasn't there an effort to restrict in Kenya Chinese fish, and then the Chinese ambassador basically levied a threat, right?
So
Tell us
the
about
fishing issue, particularly in a lot of countries, but in Kenya in particular, the fishing issue comes up every election season, because Kenya is like many African countries. It cannot catch enough fish to feed its own people, so it must rely on frozen Chinese imports. That is just the reality that we have. But every political season, what ends up happening is politicians want the fishing vote. So they come in and they say, we're going to ban Chinese fish from coming into Kenya. What was very interesting is that China, the ambassador was furious and threatened trade sanctions against Kenya if they imposed that ban. So that is, and the Kenyans backed down. They just did this again, the Chinese didn't bite, and it went on. But the problem in Kenya is you have the lack of capacity, that you don't have the trawlers at the scale that the Chinese have. The bigger issue in most of Africa, and this is the problem in Ghana, is that it is the complicity of the Ghanaian government that facilitates the corruption in the distant fishing fleet. If the Ghanaian government had followed through on its fine of $1 million to a Chinese trawler but let it go, then we'd have a different story. But the Ghanaian government is largely to blame for the presence of the distant fishing fleet, and you look at an example like in Liberia, where the minister blocked the Chinese from using their waters, and they just went next door up the coast to Ghana. So governance becomes a very big issue in this question of fishing.
Great, and again, referencing our discussions of agency as well there. Any other questions? Oh yeah, Yunnan.
Hi, thanks so much for all your presentations. I really enjoyed all of them. I have two questions directed to Sharon and to Joseph. To Sharon, I had a question on your perspectives on the different ethnic groups and their responses to the railway. So you kind of alluded a little bit to the existing ethnic tensions between Amhara, Oromo, Somali regions, and I was wondering from your experience that did you see different or a differentiation in how different ethnic groups were employed in the railway? It goes through many of these territories, but do we see a differential benefit in terms of which ethnic groups? And also just an anecdote, because I also did some fieldwork on the railway and the issue about the compensation issues for the animals. When I was there, they were saying that it started because the ERC, the Ethiopian Railway Corporation, set the price of camels higher than the market price of camels. And so people had an incentive to push their older camels onto the rail track or just leave them there and then collect the compensation after. So, the ERC were really trying to phase this out, and I think the last time I checked, they had stopped compensating locals. But I wonder what you saw about how protests change when responding to these different incentives. And to Joseph's presentation, I found quite interesting and a bit of a puzzle in the map that you showed with the quite different perceptions of China, and tying to this theme of railway. I noticed between Ethiopia and Kenya, both countries that have received massive and very similar types of infrastructure investment, giant railways, for example, standard gauge railways, but you see a much higher positive perception of China from Kenyans than you do from Ethiopians. And so wondering, do you see puzzles across the continent between countries that should have relatively similar kinds of engagement from China, but very different perceptions of China, and why that might be?
Those are great questions. Sharon, would you like to go first?
So regarding the ethnic groups, there is a really very deep politics and very complex politics between the different groups and the different tribes within the groups. And the thing is that when a Turkish company comes to Ethiopia, she does field research. She talks with the chiefs. She asks them, what do you need? How can I help you? How can you help me for this project to success? And the Chinese didn't do this kind of thing out of respect to the local government, not intentionally and however the consequence is that they had local station master, and the station master usually in Dir Dawa and Adama he was from Oromo region. In Furilabu he was an Amhara. Generally speaking, there are no Somalis working at the Chinese developmental projects. And this is a very, very complex and delicate situation because there were times that Somalis were hired and the language in work is Amhara, so everybody can communicate. It's a kind of putonghua. And eventually the Somalis were really upset from the fact they have to speak Amhara. And the Oromo deliberately spoke Oromo as a kind of political statement. And it was a complete mess. They just couldn't work. So eventually, the Chinese didn't know what to do because they don't used to manage this kind of situations, and the local station master had to solve it. So eventually, the local station master started to employ his friends. I think this is the definition of corruption. So everybody is unhappy, and there's a very similar process happened in the factories, in the plants, in the industrial zones. But it's less like in a train station. We have 32 workers. In an industrial zone, sometimes we have 4,000 or more, even more. So I hope.
I think we can get a sense from this example of the tensions along the Belt and Road that are magnified. This is one case study, but you can imagine if you're involved in hundreds of countries around the world, these kinds of ethnic tensions you've got to grapple with almost on each and every project. They're different and unique. So that's excellent. Joseph, oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about the Tigranians. The Tigrans. Actually, I've been in. I visited Ethiopia in 2019 and 2020, and it was just before the civil war erupted, and actually it was there. The Oromo already started it, and the North, because of many internal problems, started it after the announcement of the election delay. So those tensions were always there, ready to be explored.
Thank you. Joseph, to you.
Well, yes, I think for your question, this is what I hope that the academics will come in and try to explore. So what explains this? Of course, some of our analysis do show that there are several factors that drive this. The age of democracy, like how old a country has been democratic, is one factor that drives this. Another thing is just looking at levels of political competition, and that actually influences how people perceive China in their own countries. And of course, the micro level dynamics, as we spoke about, is the experiences of people with Chinese and how China involves themselves in various aspects of, let's say, mining or other engagements, and the animosity that exists between citizens and Chinese. The greater the concentration of Chinese in a particular country, does have an influence on how people actually perceive China. But what we see more and more is people now beginning to look internally when it comes to model for development. So increasingly we see several African countries pointing to South Africa as a model, an aspiration for their own country. And so it does seem like even though China and the US continue to dominate, people are beginning to look internally for sources of motivation and encouragement. But I think that, of course, there are lots of other factors that may be driving this, and that's what we leave to the academics to do.
I just have to say, as somebody who's been to South Africa, I find it somewhat surprising because South Africa is not, at least where I've been, is not necessarily safe. It's not prospering. There's tensions politically. So I find it fascinating that South Africa appeared there. So that's great. I think we saw a hand over here.
Thank you very much. I think this question can be answered by Eric or Joseph. What do you think is China's growing soft power in Africa? All of the thesis in this session and the previous session is about how China's realism and how China's hard power is outdoing America. But one of the interesting things about the 20th century was also the blue pair of jeans, and the American cinema, and the American food, and the music. Coca-Cola. So it's a very important question for somebody who is from India, because we see the American soft power very much. And I'm curious, how do you understand this?
So the traditional definition of soft power, according to Joseph Nye, is to get people to do things without using hard power. So culture was very important. But we define soft power in a very narrow focus. For us, it is Beyonce, Marlboro, Starbucks, and McDonald's, okay? Here is the painful reality that too many Americans have not come to grips with. You can wear Levi's, drink Starbucks, smoke a Marlboro, and hate America. The same, and again, this happens quite a bit. I see it in many parts of the world. And now, the United States is still an aspirational power for many people. There's no doubt about it. But it has taken a hit on its brand in the past 5 to 7 years. There's no doubt about that either. The Chinese definition of soft power is radically different. If you look on the Chinese Twitter pages of embassies and ambassadors, it is basically an entire stream of infrastructure porn right down the middle. Okay? It is, we've built this bridge, we've built this road, we've built in our lifetime, my lifetime. I lived in China in 1989 when there was food rations and nothing. And in my lifetime, they've gone from that to the second largest economy in the world. That is an incredibly compelling messaging developing in the global south. And we underestimate it because we have infrastructure. Well, Europe, Japan, Singapore has infrastructure. The Americans, it's a different story. But for the rest of the world, that infrastructure narrative, that development narrative is incredibly compelling. And it's something that we don't fundamentally understand in the West very well. That people want a better life, and they want a better life for their kids. Let me just give you one example. When I live in Vietnam, and I used to run a very large TV channel. I took a lot of my young people out for work, for lunch one day, 25 young, 22, 23-year-old Vietnamese. I said, if you could have any political system in the world, what would you want? Anything. Democracy, anything. What country do you think that they said? And it was unanimous. There was one country that stood out. This isn't Vietnam. It was not China. They hate China.
USA.
Definitely not. Singapore. Why? Because Singapore delivers everything that they want. Efficient services, no corruption, good education for their kids, subsidized housing, subsidized health. Everything works. And they are willing to compromise civil and political rights in order to have the social and economic rights. And we continue to focus on civil and political rights as the paramount preeminent right. And that is a narrative that does not flow in places where nothing works. In Vietnam, nothing works. The day-to-day life is just, and again, in many of the African countries. And so when China comes on and says, we're going to bring efficiency, modernization, and modernization without westernization. Again, it's another Japanese trait as well. Modernization does not equate westernization. They like that too in many respects. This is very, very complex, but that's a version of soft power that I think is poorly understood in many parts of the world.
Joseph, before you jump in on this, I want to put a little finer point on this question. So from the examples provided and from the American perspective, soft power is often something that comes from the grassroots up, right? The United States government did not create hip-hop music. We didn't create McDonald's. We didn't create, the British didn't create Manchester United in order to be attractive, right? But the Chinese create, as you say, infrastructure, websites, right? It's what I would call foreign-focused propaganda work or Africa-focused propaganda work. It's a top-down effort versus a grassroots effort. Hold on, let me at least get the point out. And so, how does this, which is more attractive at this point? Because you say you can wear Levi's jeans and you can also like infrastructure, right? So is it a choice that one has to make, or can you both be more favorable towards the US and be more favorable towards China simultaneously?
Just one very quick.
What do the kids want to say?
Okay, here's the kids' point. I was in Ivory Coast in 2019, and I went up to a bunch of teenagers, and when we're talking about Africa, forget about people our age. This is a continent, the 19.4 is the median age, so it's about teens. I said, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez des Chinois? What do you think of the Chinese? They thought, why is a white guy asking me about the Chinese? Okay. And then they paused for a minute, they talked to each other a little bit. They said, la Chine, c'est super. I said, what? China is great. And I said, okay, really, why? He took out his phone. I love Huawei, I love Boomplay, I love TikTok. They see the world through what they're touching in tech. That is soft power. Chinese tech is very much soft power. Everybody knows TikTok comes from China, Boomplay comes from China, ZTE comes from China.
Where do the kids of the elite go to school?
In China, by the way, in China, they can't get visas to go to the United States.
They're not going
They can't get visas to go to the United States. The United States shut that down. They can't go anywhere else.
Okay, I want to hear from Joseph, but every African I talked to said if I can come to the US, I would come and give me a scholarship.
I doubt that I can add much more to this, but I certainly would be totally with what he's saying, because when we talk about soft, it's just what people experience. And usually, we talk about democracy, yes, the intrinsic value of democracy is important, human rights, respect of rule of law and the like, but to what extent are people really getting fulfilled economically? Like, are they getting a good life? And I think that's the bottom line. Lots of people want to have a good life, and in some cases, the feeling of I'm ready to sacrifice some level of human rights to be able to get to a good life is there. That doesn't mean that we should undermine or just write off human rights, but that they have to go together. And so if you come investing in areas where it is more of a critique of a government because of a certain issue, human rights issue, without thinking about the economic side, and that's where the challenge comes in. So.
All right, I see some questions here. Over here, and then over there. Dave.
Okay, thank you for that. One question to Eric and another to Sharon. First to Eric, you mentioned that FOCAC was, in 2021, it seemed that Africa had gotten its concerns on the agenda, right? That previously it was China that was driving the agenda, but in 2021, Africa got some concerns on the agenda. So my question is, what leverage did Africa have to be able to get its concerns on the agenda, since you mentioned that Africa plays a relatively insignificant role in China's trade? Or was FOCAC 2021 just propaganda?
So this is very interesting because in the
Eric, can we take two questions just so we have enough? Because I want to make sure we get this other question. So, but we're not going to forget this. This is a great question, very important.
Ilan Alon, professor, Ariel University of Agder. I have recently published 2 papers which looked at the relationship between corruption and investment in Africa from China. And to our surprise, we found the opposite result. than what we would find in Western Europe and America. That is, that the higher the level of corruption, the more likely you are to get investment. So we were actually curious and we started looking at the moderating effects, like what is the role of foreign aid or what is the role of the Belt and Road Initiative? And in both cases, these two initiatives, the Belt and Road and foreign aid, increase the relationship, the positive relationship between corruption and foreign aid. So it seems as though Chinese investment follows the Angola model. That is to say that whole sort of financial deals by corrupt officials working with elite business people supported by the Chinese government in order to get the resources out of Africa. Do you see the same kind of relationship between investment and corruption in Africa?
All right, that's two good ones. I guess, Eric, you can kick off and then Joe.
So what we saw in 2021, early 2021, when the negotiations were underway among the Beijing diplomatic corps and the Chinese, and it was the the African diplomatic corps in Beijing that led the talks for the agenda. It was very, very tense. The Chinese came first and said, this is what we want to do. The African diplomatic corps, for really one of the first times that we've seen, work together as a group. We do not see very many examples of Pan-Africanism. But in this particular case, they bonded together as a group and they pushed back hard. The problem is, the risk for the Chinese is that if the relationship with Africa implodes politically, the negative PR of that would be tremendous. So you say, what leverage do they have? If the talks broke down in the run-up to FOCAC, that would be a PR disaster of unmanageable proportions. So the African delegations seemed to feel that they knew that, and they pushed much harder this year than they did in previous years.
On the issue of the relationship between corruption and investment? Maybe...
Well, I wouldn't be surprised to see that, and partly because whether it is a moderating effect or that foreign investment is agnostic to corruption is one thing you can imagine, because in some cases, of course, I'll give the example where even if you know that a country is corrupt, you know, why would governments in any part of the world continue to give? Of course, you would say China may not mind of the corruption because they're trying to invest and influence governments in different ways. Of course, the West also does that. You know, it's not the case that because a government is corrupt, USAID will not give funding to Ghana or something, because Ghana's government has become increasingly, inept and corrupt, but then they continue to receive all of this support. And so it becomes like a mixed thing. It feels like, to what extent will corruption undermine how much the US government gives to Ghana? It's not clear, right? And so I'm not surprised that you are finding that. As to whether or not we are finding it in our studies, maybe not. I'm not sure about that, but
Well, Joseph, building on that though, if that's the relationship, then what are the grassroots implications of that, right? If you're able to get investment by being corrupt, and this is bringing in investment, it seems that there should be some grassroots discontent. Is there?
Yeah, I mean, you would think that there will be discontent, but it depends on what the corruption is leading to. Because then if the ruling party have their grassroots supporters who benefit from these corrupt acts, it's not something that you can just wonder, because the grassroots is not necessarily going to revolt, because half of the population is probably not going to revolt. And there's no momentum for it, right?
But there is a perception in many African countries that the Chinese work in collusion with elites to their detriment. And Africa is the youngest continent in the world, but it has the oldest leaders in the world. And the distance between the rulers and the ruled is wider than almost anywhere else. So the skepticism about the Chinese that you see on the ground oftentimes is, well, he's corrupt with them, and it's all the shady deals, the lack of transparency, and all of that. You see that quite a bit.
Could I give one quick anecdote? When I was in Poland minister's office. I was sitting there waiting to talk to the minister, and there was a Chinese gentleman sitting next to me with blueprints. And I said in Chinese to him, because nobody else in the office spoke Chinese, well, what are the blueprints for? Of course, I was quite interested. He rolled his eyes at me, and he said, they're for this guy's mistress's house. And I said, well, what are you doing that for? And he goes, well, in order to do the project I've come for, I've got to build this guy's mistress a house. You know, so he wasn't thrilled to be doing it, but it was the cost of doing business in order to advance the ball on other projects. And so maybe this can help explain your findings and explain what Joseph was saying and what Eric was referring to. And it's an isolated incident, it's one data point, but it's an experience. So
if I get only one listener.
But there is something very interesting. There is something very interesting happened in Sri Lanka. The Rajapaksa was airlifted with his family because the public went to attack him, precisely for this, that he and his family colluded with the Chinese investors.
And that's the story behind Havakota, is that they wanted to put Havakota in port. The Chinese didn't want to put the port in Havakota. They talked against it, but it was the Sri Lankans that said, put it in Havakota. Okay, knock yourself out, but that was in his backyard, in his hometown. And that's really important.
I think we have time for one more short question before we go to the break. If not, that's okay. I think maybe we can go and at 4:30, we're going to get some coffee. We're going to get recharged. We're going to breathe, and then we're going to come back here for our final panel, which we're really excited. Tuvia will be moderating. So please join us in 15 minutes back here. Thank you.